stories about my experiences with dissonance. Dissonance being this really interesting thing when two conflicting elements come together in a clash. And I want you to think about for a moment if you tend to enjoy things that are more or less dissonant. And so I remember when I was 7 years old, I had seen a movie where the Ku Klux Klan was burning crosses, and I sat up in bed that night completely unable to sleep. I was terrified that as a Latino, I would be targeted for violence, that they would find my home, that they would find me. And I was sobbing so hard that one of my parents came in to console me by telling me that I looked white and Irish, and they wouldn't know my last name was Sanchez, so I was likely going to be safe. And this was a moment of extreme dissonance in my racial identity. I appeared white, but by many standards in the US, including my own, I was a person of color and could be hated for that. And I remember when I was 16, I was so frustrated because I wanted to donate blood. It was really important to me in case an emergency arose in the community, there was a blood supply, and I couldn't. And I told my mother to go donate blood in case an emergency arose, and she asked, well, why don't you just go donate blood? And I said, because as a gay man, I am banned from donating blood in the US, and still am. And it was so important to me to push her to donate blood, but it was another moment of dissonance because while she accepted and loved and frankly didn't really care who I was not being accepted by society and in fact was even banned for who I was. And then a few years after that, I remember the racial dissonance kind of reared its ugly head again when I got into college. I got into the college of my choice, early decision, and I was told that the only reason I got into the university I did was because I was Latino, or to be more specific, because I was a dirty Mexican. Now, it's neither here nor there. I'm actually not Mexican, but I actually even adopted that and started calling myself a dirty Mexican. I couldn't reconcile the dissonance in my identity, and I couldn't even, at that point, identify it. And I even spent a few years after that writing chapters in a hypothetical book about my race, my ethnicity, my national identity, my politics, and trying to understand how they intersect and what that means for me. And then when I was in college, I remember I took a class in feminism for two reasons. One, because I heard it was easy, and two, because my friend was in it, which are both very good reasons to take classes, by the way. And it was actually the most challenging academic experience I will probably ever have. It pushed me to see how gender is constructed in society, to understand what it means to live in a patriarchy. And it implicated me for my male privilege, but as a gay man, I also experienced oppression. So again, I had this moment of dissonance as I began to examine the system of power connected to our gender structure in society. And so years later, that brings me here. All of these stories, though, had something in common. They were all moments of extreme dissonance that completely altered the way I see the world, that completely changed my worldview, and I couldn't go back. And if we look at dissonance and the frequency with which it appears in the English written language since the 1880s, it's amazing that we can even do this, you can see that it starts to climb through the 1960s, peaks in 1968, starts to drop in the 70s and levels off, not really returning even close to where it was at that time. And I'm not a history teacher, but 1968 was a year of really profound change in our society. There are books written about 1968 called The Year That Rocked the World, and Rebellions of Rage, and Global Revolutions. And so in that moment, perhaps we were using dissonance as a vehicle for changing the world. At the very least, we were talking about dissonance more. And so I want to go back to that moment of my racial identity dissonance when I was watching that movie. It's still something I negotiate every day, But in that moment, I was feeling intense fear. I was terrified. And fear can be very paralyzing. Fear can make us insecure. Fear can cause us to hate. But what that response is an attempt to harmonize dissonant parts, to put two things together that don't really fit together. And somehow I was comfortable with dissonance. I even enjoyed dissonance. Enjoying dissonance is in and of itself dissonant, but somehow I was living it, I was negotiating it, I was navigating it, I was being in it and with it. And recently, I found an acrostic poem of my name that I wrote when I was 10 years old that I completely forgot doing. And it was full of contradictions. And so I found myself to be enjoyable, but a nag to everyone, or delightful, but impatient. And I also had no small sense of self, considering I started with G for genius. But the point was that clearly I was not seeking a harmony or a consistency of identity. I was comfortable being in contradiction. And we all have moments of contradiction. We all have these moments of dissonance that could begin to change the way we see the world. And we often think that these moments require trauma or crisis, but perhaps if we learned to enjoy dissonance, we could use that as a vehicle for changing the world. And so, upon reflecting on my experience now as an educator, I realized that I teach because I want people to enjoy dissonance. And so the question remains, how? And I've kind of come up with three really broad ways that we can think about how we can do this. So the first is to enjoy dissonance, to revel in things that are incongruous, to look for that discomfort, that tension, and really examine when something happens that is completely different from what you expected, and you are either right or wrong in ways that you couldn't even imagine. And the second is to cultivate patience. So be present in the moment, pay attention so that when dissonance happens, you can identify it, you can feel it. And the third is to seek other points of view. Transporting yourself into a narrative has enormous power, and that is how we can see and feel and experience the world beyond us. And the stories that we're being told are not diverse. They seek to over-harmonize. So we need to find stories that are not who we are and that are not what we expect. And most importantly, we have to tell our own story. And so I have one last story for you, which is when I was 31, which was not all that long ago. I was really inspired by a middle school student who I asked to consider what her life would be like if she were to wake up the next day and be a boy. And this is what she had to say: "I wouldn't call my mother mama and hug or kiss her." And that revelatory moment was a moment of dissonance, a moment in which she was experiencing the discomfort of our inequality in gender. And it made me realize that we can support each other to have epiphanies of dissonance. We can enjoy our own dissonance, but we can make sure that we help each other feel safe and feel empowered so that as we experience these moments, we can come through them and be ready to connect the dots, to connect to each other, and to live with compassion in a changed world. So enjoy your dissonance, and thank you very much.